Welcome to the Student Learning Commons. Today we're going to talk about writing a research paper. The presentation will go by quickly, so don't forget that you can pause at any point in time or go back and rewind to look at something again. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that this recording is actually taking place on the unceded and rightfully owned territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, who used to consider Burnaby Mountain the shopping basket because they could hunt and fish and it provided for all of their needs. The other campuses of the university are located on the unceded and rightfully owned territories of the Coquitlam, the Kwantlen, the Cutsey, the Semiahmoo, the Kikite, and the Tawasin. Wherever you are seated today, take a moment to consider the people who have stewarded the land you're on for millennia so that you can join us here today and do some learning. Today in this presentation, we're going to cover choosing and focusing a topic, developing a research question, reading strategically and critically, drafting a working thesis, and then how to write an introduction, how to develop your paragraphs, and how to write a conclusion. So what is a research paper? A research paper can be one of two things: a paper that documents and explains the methods and primary findings or results of an original study, so primary research, or it could be a paper that analyzes and explains the existing scholarly research. If you're doing secondary research, for example, in a particular subject area or field of study. Most undergraduate research papers fall into category 2. You're actually reading other people's primary research in your own secondary research. But sometimes you'll be asked to write papers that fall into category 1, especially if you're taking a methods class. Common sections in papers in category 1 are introduction, literature review, methods, results and findings, discussion, conclusion, and references. Well, these headings are not necessary, and they're not necessarily needed in all research papers in category 2. They're all relevant aspects of research for you to be analyzing when you read secondary sources. For instance, it can be interesting to compare previously conducted studies by looking at both the methods that they used and their results or findings, or the results or findings and how they're interpreted in the discussion and conclusion sections. In either case, it's therefore a good idea to learn about these different sections and how to read them strategically. So, what do you need to do when you're choosing and focusing a topic? You should be thinking about what has been said in class. What have you seen or experienced? What is your lived experience of this thing? So what do you bring to the topic already that you know about? And then what makes you curious? These are the useful bits. Whatever makes us curious is going to be more interesting for us and probably more interesting for our reader. So try different brainstorming techniques to narrow or limit broad concepts in your topic area. You might use an abstraction ladder where you're moving along different topics and narrowing them down. You might create a mind map. You might use thematic clustering or compare and contrast table or some free writing. I use a combination of all of these, and I love to use post-it notes in a mind map formation or thematic clustering where I put them directly on the wall of my office as I organize ideas and decide what I'm going to write about. Don't be afraid to start with exploratory questions. These can be really useful for narrowing down our topics. What is this topic? When did it start? How long has it been going on? How or where does it fit in to other things? How does it work? How does it compare or contrast with other things? How might it affect other elements or people? And what might happen? What if? Don't be afraid to get to those speculative questions. Even if you don't use them directly in your initial drafts, thinking about the what ifs can get you to some interesting conclusions. As you develop a research question, you might use this circle. So if you can't see this slide on the device as you're viewing this video, I'm going to describe this. So we really use a circular format as we're looking at our research question. We're going to define it, and it defines a research problem that leads us to a research answer that helps us solve a practical or conceptual problem that motivates a research question. Research questions that we start with are often only working questions, and they might refine themselves as we continue in our research. So don't be afraid if your research question changes, because your thinking and your knowledge about your topic has also changed. These are things that evolve along with our learning. So ask yourself, as you're going through developing your research question, what are you hoping your readers will take away from your story? Greater understanding or more insight? Is it conceptual? Are you looking to offer your readers some means to address, improve, ameliorate a condition? So is it practical advice that you're offering? By determining your focus at the outset, you can help bring focus to your research and to your writing. This can also give you clues as to the genre or style that you should be using in your writing. What is a research question? It is a clear, focused, complex, and arguable question around which you center your research. You might, for example, start with the question, how has social media changed friendships in the 2000s? The research question or questions define your research problem and help you seek research answers. As I said before, though, these might evolve along with your research and understanding of the topic. Don't be afraid to refine your research question. So, research question needs to be clear. With so much research available on any given topic, research questions must be as clear as possible in order to be effective in helping the writer direct their research. If your question isn't clear, your writing and your path forward into finding out what you need to know is not going to be clear either. So clarity in your question will help you save time as you do your research. Your research question also has to be focused. This means narrowing it down. Research questions must be specific enough to be well covered in the space available. Remember, you're usually not being asked to write a book. So if your topic isn't focused, you'll have a hard time getting your information into a narrow slice of space and time. Your research question also has to be complex. If you can answer your research question with a simple yes or no, or by easily found facts, that is not a good research question. Research questions should, rather, require both research and analysis on the part of the writer. Remember that it is vulnerable to create a complex research question. It means that people could argue with you. But this is one of the most exciting parts of writing the question, because it allows you to look for research that will help support some of the claims that you make in your paper. So, for example, why are social media sites harmful? Well, is this a good question to start with? What sites are you talking about? And what do you mean by harmful? That seems to make a value judgment. So try this one instead. How are online users experiencing or addressing privacy issues on Snapchat? Notice that we made improvements right away. We were very specific about the site. Now we're simply talking about Snapchat. What are we talking about? Harmful? Well, we've explained that there are privacy issues and that these are issues that users might be facing. So now we're focused on Snapchat, and we've specified privacy as a central topic or problem. This is getting towards a very good research question. How should you generate a research question? What will be helpful to you? So first of all, choose a general topic of interest. And interest is key here. If you choose a topic that you find boring, that's going to come across to your readers as well. So try to find something that is of interest, not just to readers, but also to you. Do some preliminary research to see what research has already been done. So what have people already written about this topic that you're thinking of writing on? Can you find a space that hasn't been written on it? What are people saying? Do you agree or disagree? This might help determine what kinds of questions the topic generates. And once you've done this preliminary searching of what's already been written, start asking some open-ended questions like how, what, and why. Evaluate possible responses to those questions. These will help guide you towards your own, much more specific, complex research question. So as you refine your research question, you're going to be making some statements to help yourself narrow and focus. Your topic is, I am studying X. Okay, continue that. Why? I'm studying X because I want to find out why. Okay, continue along that line. I'm studying X because I want to find out why in order to better understand or help readers better understand Z. Now you have something that's getting complex. You have your X, Y, Z. I actually start with these sentences as I'm looking at my topic, and it helps me clarify the question that I'm going to pose. Sometimes we also use this understanding to help create a desired action or change. In a research paper, these often take the form of recommendations or suggestions for future areas of research. This advice comes from a book by Booth, Colomb, and Williams called The Craft of Research, their 3rd edition. And this is something that, if that's of interest to you, you might want to check out. This is listed at the bottom of the slide if you're able to read that. So as you're refining your research question, perhaps you might drill down into it like this. I'm studying the ways social media has supported the Idle No More movement. Well, why? Okay, because I want to find out how Indigenous people and their allies are able to connect and support one another using online platforms. Okay. Well, why do you want to do that? Well, I want to do that in order to determine if social media platforms can be optimized in order to better support Indigenous activism across Canada. See how this gets you to a much more specific question. If this is my research focus, I might ask a couple of different questions. What social media tools has Idle No More used? Did Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies connect using these same tools? Were these tools effective in fostering connection and advancing the goals of the movement? And are there examples where the tools were ineffective and could be refined to better meet this specific purpose? All of these questions are going to help you with your research and producing a paper from a research question that is specific and narrow and answerable. So why don't you try it? Your topic, I am studying, fill in the blank, because I want to find out, fill in the blank, in order to better understand or help readers better understand or provide improvements to, or whatever it is, fill in the blank. And then, is there a practical significance? Do you have recommendations that you think you'll be making? It's okay to start with hypotheses before you're doing your research. Doesn't mean you have to come to those same conclusions. But sometimes when we start with what we think we might find, it's easier to actually see when we don't find that information or when we find something different. Why don't you take a moment to pause the video here and fill in these sentences for yourself to help yourself as you get closer to a refined, complex research question. Come back and join me when you've finished. So in order to research properly, you want to read strategically. So reading strategically means reading with your research questions or arguments in your mind. You're always looking for where you can gather information and connect it to the paper that you're writing. So you can try reading articles side by side rather than one after another. This works for some people. So take all of those articles and read the introduction or the abstracts each first, and then read section by section across each of the papers. It might be easier for you to see what different things they're saying about those topics as you do that. And reading articles side by side means looking at how they actually speak to each other rather than completing one and then moving on to the next one, just thinking about each paper in isolation. If reading side by side is something you think might work for you, then it's a good idea to use the system from the beginning. Make notes about your questions and thoughts as you read, especially when you make connections to other ideas or things that you've already read. You may think that these are obvious, and so you're bound to remember them, but it's amazing how easily we can forget things and they slip away, especially as our brains get full, and as we are more and more pressured as we get closer to the deadline for our paper. The image in the footer here is an example, so you can see, for those of you who might not be able to see it on your devices, it's got a ton of highlighting in one color. In fact, it looks like the entire book has been highlighted, perhaps in pink or in blue or in yellow. And this is an example of non-strategic reading. You'll notice that everything is highlighted. And of course, that's an exaggeration, but many of us do over highlight. And one of the traps that we fall into is thinking, I'll just highlight anything that might be important. And then of course we end up highlighting everything and having to reread to pick out the truly important bits. So scholarly writing is all about emphasizing important things. So instead of highlighting everything, you really want to push yourself to read while you think about your specific research questions and not just thinking about what could be generically or generally important. Reading critically. So how do we do this? A summary captures what a source says. It is a restatement. And I often try to summarize what I've read in 1 to 3 sentences, maybe 5 at the most, short sentences. It's really hard to do, summarizing like that. But I also find it very helpful. An analysis goes much further. An analysis is expressing what the source means. What were those authors talking about? And why were they talking about it this way? So already you're getting into interpretation. And analysis is useful because it's the moment where we start to teach our readers how to see this thing that we've just summarized, right? How should they be looking at it, in our opinion, from our point of view, from the point of view of our paper? So for example, we're analyzing the assumptions that the author is using to base their argument. We're looking for patterns of language or evidence that's emerging. We're looking for the kinds of evidence or the method that the author is using. And are there situations where the argument might not really apply? Did the author not really imagine deeply enough? Do we think that there could have been more information? And is that a place for us to intervene? Or has another author that we've encountered talked about this? So then we can bring that other author in. That's an opportunity to start to synthesize some of the information that we found from our research. So a critical evaluation expresses why the source matters. We then talk about the so what. What's the author's agenda? How does this reading relate to others or to what you're learning? So your assignments are asking you to do this kind of interpretation of the text that you're reading and to make connections between them. So think about, what do all of the articles you've read collectively suggest about the topic or the state of research in this field? Which questions seem relatively settled already, but which questions remain? And what ones are under considerable debate by scholars? That's where you find really interesting information to share with your reader. Are there some important questions that aren't being asked yet? What are they? And these are the kinds of questions that will also help you move into critical evaluation, not just of each individual source, but of your subject or field of study more broadly. And these might also be questions that then follow you into different courses as you continue in your field of study. Identifying themes is really important, and it's an early part of the outlining process. It's how you begin to get a sense of what you might focus on in your paper by looking at where there seems to be interesting connections or tensions in what you're already studying. So resonance refers to how well ideas fit together or connect. And when there is a general agreement on an idea or point across several articles that you've found, there's going to be a high degree of resonance. Conversely, where scholars disagree with one another, there will be a high degree of dissonance in that field. Okay, so both resonance and dissonance can be interesting to note and focus on in your analysis. As you're going through your readings, try to talk back to the authors that you're reading, at least in your own notes. And many of us will often write little things in the margins of the papers that we've printed out or the textbooks that we've purchased. And sometimes they're just happy faces or unhappy faces, or even question marks where we have a question, or exclamation marks where we're kind of in disbelief that the author would even believe this. Try to write down and respond to critical questions as you reread. And then focus on your talk back to that article or that chapter or that author on the key issues in your own research question that may have been raised in class. Try to highlight any patterns that you see emerging. Are there words or ideas that are being repeated? Is there a kind of importance of something that's coming up in the field? Are there similar arguments that you're seeing emerge? And where is this resonance and dissonance? What kinds of connections or associations can you make? Or are the authors making them amongst themselves? And sometimes it's really interesting to see that authors will include authors that they've read and that you're also reading in their own discussions. So some of them will already be in discussion themselves, and that gets kind of exciting. So let's look at developing a working thesis. So a formal thesis is made up of a claim, and that is a debatable statement requiring proof. Remember, it cannot be a yes/no answered question. A claim must be debatable. And that makes you a bit vulnerable, but that's a good thing. It also has to be made up of reasons. So these are arguments that prove, support, or justify the claim that you've made. And between the claim and the reasons, you're going to have connections because, okay? So you're going to create some linkages here. The claim is happening because reason, et cetera, or reason and reason, therefore claim, okay? So a simple thesis statement might be something like, cats make the best pets because they are more self-sufficient than dogs and more affectionate than fish. Okay, so now I've alienated all the non-cat lovers and all the people who think that fish are incredibly affectionate. But just to give you a very basic and silly example, and the next slide is going to show another way that we can break down an argument. So have a look at this. The claim: there are persistent myths about Indigenous peoples in Canada, and these myths perpetuate a colonial mindset. That is your claim. Now you're going to need to provide something to back that up. So your data number one might be myth that Indigenous peoples don't pay taxes, and that myth fosters resentment among settlers and also establishes Indigenous peoples as reliant on the Canadian state. Okay, and reinforcing that this is a myth. Okay. And what is your reason? Your warrant is the basis for everything. It's really important to go through the looking at the warrant. It's an assumption or point of agreement shared by the arguer and the audience. And so this is your point where you're trying to sort of meet your audience where they're at. And in argument, we rely frequently on these fundamental shared assumptions. So warrants might remain unspoken. They might just be understood when a writer and reader can be expected to know or agree on them. But whether they're spoken or not, the warrant provides a really important link between the evidence that you're providing and the claim that you've made. If readers don't share the same assumptions about the validity of your evidence, the evidence you've chosen as a writer, or if your readers don't recognize the assumption, they might not accept the evidence or the claim. So it's really important that, especially when you're revising, you're looking at how you've put all of these pieces together. Are they believable by your reader? Will they be believed? And so be thinking about that you're going to have your claim, and you're going to have some, you're going to have some data, you might have some qualifiers and some rebuttal, but these are all connecting through the warrant. What is a qualifier? It's a word or phrase, it might be an adjective or adverb that limits the scope or generalizability of your claim. If you don't have a qualifier, your claim might seem too broad or unrealistic. Okay, so if you look at the claim here in the argumentation, you can pick out some of the qualifiers that are already there, okay, that help limit the statement that you're making. So, for example, if you say, taking another example, students struggle with writing, you'd be making an overstatement or overgeneralization, because not all students, despite the fact that many of us struggle with writing, but not all students do. So you might want to qualify that so that you're not making an overstatement or overgeneralization. So make sure that you might say many students struggle with writing, or you might be even more specific than that and choose a particular group of students who tend to struggle more with writing, or the circumstances in which some students struggle with writing. Try to avoid binary or either or thinking, which can invalidate some of the arguments you're making. You might say, for example, sometimes, or at times, or occasionally, or frequently, many, or some, or more, a few, or a small number, or most. Try to avoid saying always or never. Try definitely to avoid saying all students, all people. Your reader can usually have some kind of argument against that. And wherever possible, be as specific as you can. Notice here that we have backing below the warrant, and backing is additional information that justifies or enhances the credibility, the believability of your evidence. So how do you know that your audience will accept your data or evidence? You may need some backing. So if you give evidence like, my weather app predicts rain will start around noon, you may need to add why this is a good app, and perhaps that more than 90% of its users gave it 5 stars. Okay, so make sure that your backing is also believable. I haven't spoken about rebuttal yet, so let's just address that now. Conditions of rebuttal are the potential objections to an argument. So essentially, you're deeply imagining your readers and how skeptical they might be. Are they likely to believe what you're going to say in this paper? Or are they going to be like, no, that's ridiculous, that's not true? And you're going to try to deal with that, with their arguments now. So skeptical readers will try to poke holes in our arguments as they're reading, and they try to come up with opposite, equally valid reasons as they're reading. And by the time they get to the end, they might have totally disagreed with us. So to deal with these objections while we're writing and before our readers are reading, we might need to provide additional evidence. And these could be qualifiers, warrants, changing our warrants. And so we might need to say something like, though not all readers will accept these, they will at least see that blah, blah, blah. And really what's happening is that you're reaching out to those readers saying, hey, I realize you might be one of the readers who doesn't agree with me. So I'm reaching out to show you that I understand you're out there, but come along with me and see if I can maybe persuade you to think a little bit differently, make a shift in your own thinking. So there are lots of resources to help you organize your argument. And some of the ones that we like and support at the Student Learning Commons are found at Purdue's Online Writing Lab. If you search within their website for organizing your argument, you will find a lot of information there to help you. So obviously, just having spoken about the audience member who might argue with you, your reader who's going to push back, it's really important for us to be thinking about our audience as we're writing. So does your audience have more expertise than you, roughly equal expertise, or less expertise than you? I would say that it's really important in writing to make it understandable. The more understandable you make it for more readers, the greater readership you will have, and the farther your knowledge will actually flow. David Graeber once said, he used to be a rather well-known anthropologist, and he said that it was really important to be generous with our readers and to make sure that we never made anyone feel stupid. And I know for sure as a reader that I prefer it when writers are generous with me. It's a real gift. So really think about who you're writing for. In some cases, your instructor will say you're writing for an educated audience or you're writing for me. And so you know you have to write for an expert audience. But if you're invited to write for a non-expert audience, really think about that person. Think about that reader and how you might be generous with them. What does your reader expect you to know? And how much should you explain and why? There are ways to explain a lot of information to our readers without talking down to them. And what knowledge do you share? What assumptions might you need to explain? What are some things that your reader needs to know in order to fully understand what you're talking about? And do you share any common ground with your readers? Which key concepts or assumptions do you need to explain, or will they already know? So think about this as you're drafting your own paper. Check back sometimes, like, will my reader understand? When I am doing my final revisions, I will read my paper out loud and audio record it onto my cell phone. And when I listen to what I read, I ask myself, how many readers won't understand? Where are the places where a reader who I want to reach might not understand what I'm talking about? And how can I fix that? How can I communicate better with that person? So, where to start? At the introduction. You're going to introduce your topic to your reader, and this involves explaining why it matters. You're going to provide important context or background, like what do readers need to know before they launch into your paper? Give them some background or context to why or where this topic is happening. And that's sort of part of why it matters. It's embedded in that why your topic is significant today, why they should be reading. And then state the thesis of your paper. That usually comes at the end of your opening paragraph, your introductory paragraph, but not always, but usually. And your thesis might be one, or it might be 2 or 3 sentences, usually not more than that. Avoid beginning your paper with like an overly broad statement, society today, or since the dawn of time. These are not sentences that are going to grab your reader and draw them in. So always be thinking about your audience. How should you be dealing with your body paragraphs? Well, you've probably seen the hamburger structure of a paragraph before, that you're creating this unit of meaning around a particular topic. And that's true. Your paragraph will be formed around one specific topic. And your paragraph will begin with what we call the topic sentence. And your topic sentence is kind of like a thesis statement, but just for that paragraph. It's going to explain precisely what the paragraph is about. And the topic sentence should be at or very, very near the beginning of that paragraph. You're going to develop the topic with evidence to support your thesis in your whole paper. So every topic sentence connects back to your thesis statement. And that helps every paragraph connect back to that thesis. If you find as you're revising that this is not the case, go back and just fix up some things so that they are connected, that they are clearly linked. Okay, on average, it says in this slide that paragraphs are 5 to 7 sentences long. This is not a fixed rule at all. And I'm sure you can read through a lot of different paragraphs that definitely break this non-rule. So please don't feel that you have to stick to this. However, having said that, it is important that your paragraph is a package that is readable and that your reader can move on to the next paragraph. So I find I often get critiqued that my paragraphs are far too long. And one of the things I need to do is cut them back. Sometimes if I have two topics in one of my paragraphs, I just need to divide them into two paragraphs so that I have one topic per paragraph. But other times I do have to be more concise, get to the point, and say it like it is and move on to the next paragraph. And that involves cutting out some sentences. You can do this in the revision process. So you're probably familiar with the graphic here, but if you can't read it on your own device, there's a hamburger and the bun is like your topic statement, the top of the bun with the sesame seeds. And then you've got your ingredients inside the hamburger bun. And this is where you explain your topic. You're defining ideas and you're offering some examples. That's sort of the meat of your hamburger, these examples that you've chosen from your research, and you're not just leaving them there, you're explaining them to your reader as well. So you're showing why those examples are good, why they're valid, and why they prove your point. And then the bottom of your hamburger bun, that would be the concluding sentence of your paragraph, is somehow connecting a link to your next paragraph. Now, this does not happen in your first draft. This is probably going to be crafted over a period of revisions that you're making, maybe your second, your third, your fourth draft. If you're me, your 7th or 11th draft, you're going to have paragraphs that are starting to sound really good. What should you avoid in your body paragraphs? Avoid a choppy essay. Connect your paragraphs using transitions, and these can be single words. They can also be phrases, and you can also use transitional sentences that help connect your ideas. If you have too many ideas in one paragraph, it's going to be hard for your reader to follow. Make sure that you're addressing only one topic per paragraph. And if you find that your paragraph's becoming unwieldy, think about that like a burger that's really difficult to eat because you tried to shove too many ingredients inside it, and then they all fall out the moment you take a bite. So try to make your paragraph a nice package that your reader can eat easily and gracefully. And then try to avoid ending your paragraph with a sentence that should be the topic sentence of your next paragraph. That concluding sentence is not a topic sentence. So that's really important. And then when you're looking at concluding your paper, try to synthesize the main points of the paper in a brief summary, but do not introduce new ideas or do a repeat of your introductory paragraph. We find that that's something that students think sometimes they have to do, that it's just repeating their introductory paragraph and that's the bottom of the hamburger bun for their entire essay, but that's not really the case. In fact, if you write a really compelling concluding paragraph, your readers might still be thinking about that later in the day, the next day, a couple of days later. So it's a moment for you to actually revisit the paper's thesis and then talk about how you've proven those points, how you've shown the significance that you set out to show your reader. So it's a moment where you can bring some of those things together for your reader. And consider the so what. If a reader gets to the end of your paper and the end of your conclusion and they say, so what? Why did I waste my time reading this? Then you haven't quite done your job. So take a look at your concluding paragraph to see if you have answered the so what. And that may even involve discussing broader implications of your topic. The so what can take your topic out into broader society and even into the future. But remember, do not introduce new ideas into your conclusion. So, where can you find more help? Come and visit us at the Student Learning Commons. Book a virtual or in-person appointment so that we can help you with your paper at any of its stages, including if you just got the assignment. We are happy to talk to you about your assignment and be a sounding board for your ideas and help you as you narrow down your research questions. Take care. Happy writing.